recently rewatched There Will Be Blood and was floored by the cinematography. I think there's something very interesting about the texture of that film. And it sort of made me think through some of the other recent films I've watched over the last couple of months and about how texture and lack of texture had great impacts on how I perceived the pictures. All films, TV shows, videos, photos, paintings, any visual media have some form of texture. There's a lot of factors that contribute to the texture of a piece of media. If we look at this episode of New Girl, actually, which is my girlfriend's favorite show, and one I really enjoy, actually, you can see some very interesting texture in the bokeh. Bokeh is something I have an interesting relationship with. I think it's something that's pretty heavily associated with that cinematic look, which I fucking hate that term because it doesn't mean anything. What does cinematic mean? I see the word cinematic so frequently used to describe good-looking visual media, and that drives me fucking insane. Look at this bokeh in this episode of New Girl. This is season 1, episode 9, if you want to revisit. But it's so funky, and I think I know why that is. If you look at this little spot of bokeh elements behind this little fence, it's nuts. Now, I think that this is caused by like a Glimmerglass filter, because if you look at the official Glimmerglass example images, there is all this like funky texture in the middle, and this might not be Glimmerglass. It could be any number of filters because there's 1,000 of them, and I obviously don't know what all of them are, but it's crazy, and it's in this show that's just like not the type of show where you'd expect this funky bokeh and crazy, like weird cinematography choices being made, you know? Like these types of shows, you don't typically see this type of technique being used. You see stock standard, high key, boring ass cinematography, which takes a very experienced eye to achieve, and like I've tried to shoot things high key and I think it's some of the worst things I've ever shot, and it doesn't look like New Girl. That could have been from other factors. However, back to where I started this mini rant, There Will Be Blood is a movie so full of texture that if it weren't for the story being so insanely compelling, I could have watched the whole thing and only looked at the texture of each shot. I mean, the shot that stood out to me the most, however, would be the oil derrick on Sunday's Ranch when it sets fire, and the vignette. Oh my god, dude, the vignette, are you kidding me? Okay, look at this. We've got Daniel Day-Lewis in the foreground, gorgeously silhouetted against this blazing fire in the background. Upon some light research, I found that they use these lenses called Path. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong because I don't speak French, but the Path 43mm, modified by Dan Sasaki. The fact that this lens isn't flaring when it's pointing straight at a huge bright flame is astonishing. In my experience, weird old glass usually flares like crazy whenever it gets anywhere near a bright source, let alone a bright fire like this. I mean, I don't think people realize how fucking bright fire is. In a lot of these like superhero movies, when things are blowing up, the levels of exposure within the explosion are never anywhere near as bright as they should be. If you look at Mythbusters episodes, and you look at the exposure levels of the explosions compared to the real world lit by the sun, it's fucking nuts. Fire and explosions are so incredibly bright, it's unreal. It is insane. Back to There Will Be Blood, you point a old fucked up lens at this bright fire and you don't flare, but you get this crazy vignette in the corners of the image where it's like red from the fire, but the rest of the image is so dark because it's night, but lit by this huge blaze of bright fire being exposed correctly. In my experience, weird old glass usually flares like crazy whenever it gets anywhere near a bright source, let alone a bright fire like this, unless you close it down almost completely. You look at this shot, And we're not flaring, but it's this crazy vignette. All of the people in front of the fire are completely silhouetted. I mean, it's just masterful. It's beautiful. You think about how they shot this film, and it's on film. And even with a video, like, you can get HD video tabs, whatever. You can see an image on a monitor. But that image essentially is not what is going to be put on the film. Like, you have to have such an incredible level of experience to know what you're capturing. And for a scene like this, obviously they shot tests, but for a scene like this, it looks so fucking good, dude. How? To just, like, to expose this correctly and know that it's not actually going to flare, it's just so crazy. It's so good. Although this fire scene particularly stands out in my mind, the rest of the film also looks spectacular. It has this aged, like, quote, low resolution look that I just can't get enough of. Again, texture, it just adds so much, which brings me to the most important point. On my first watch of this movie, I don't remember noticing any texture because the story and the performances are just so damn good. Good cinematography shouldn't be noticed. Of course, there are always instances where a shot is just so spectacular that it stands out in one's mind, but none of it matters if the story isn't there, or the sound isn't pulling its weight, or the performances suck, or whatever it might be. This is something that Sir Roger Deakins often talks about in his podcast, him and his wife host, where they interview industry professionals. When I saw him talk in person, yeah, I've met him, I shook his hand. When I shook his hand, I actually absorbed his decades of industry knowledge about cinematography. Look at how fucking dumbfounded I look in this picture, by the way. I digress. Deakins, as a DP, notably doesn't really add texture or frills to his images. He keeps things relatively clean because he's so focused on just telling the story in the best possible way. I can't claim to have seen all of his filmography, but from what I have seen, and from what I've heard him directly say, is that he isn't interested in creating overly stylistic shots or making his cinematography stand out from the rest of the film. Deakins is solely interested in telling the story in the most efficient and effective way. If the story calls for style, he adds style. I mean, look at No Country for Old Men, for example, one of my favorite films of all time, and shot by my good buddy, Sir Roger. I recently rewatched this film for probably the 20th time because my girlfriend got me the Criterion Collection Blu-ray. Thank you. This is a story that I know like the back of my hand, so on this watch, I was consciously going to look at the texture of the film. I almost immediately forgot I was doing this exercise because it's just so damn good. It's such a good movie, man. But looking back, I can find some great examples of texture being found through non-technical means. I mean, look at the evolution of Josh Brolin's character, Llewellyn Moss. He starts the film as this clean-cut but rough Vietnam vet cowboy character and ends it, well, spoilers, but dead. But along the way, as the story progresses and he runs for longer and longer away from possibly the greatest villain ever put to film, he gets grittier and dirtier as he is shot multiple times and has to recover from these wounds. The same goes for Javier Bardem's character, Anton Chigurh. He begins the film as this clean, terrifying psychopath who is seemingly unalterable and not vulnerable at all. He appears to be just this, like, invincible god character of death, but by the end has some humanity and grit added to him, even though he's still a fucking psychopath and shows no emotion, really. But it shows that he is vulnerable and can be injured or even killed through all these things that happen to him through the film. One of my favorite moments from a textural sense is when Chigurh chokes out the young cop towards the beginning of the film. This crazy overhead shot, we see these boot marks from both of their boots throughout the struggle. This is one of those incredible happy accidents that happen all the time when making film. This could have been planned for, but I don't think it was. You can see that there are still the scuff marks from previous takes, which to me implies that nobody really thought that it would happen. If it was thought of before, someone would have likely tried to control the amount of scuffs through changing material of the boots or the material of the floor. But I love that this happened and it made it into the film, that they just went with it. They left the scuffs, even though continuity isn't perfect, but there's one of those elements that just makes film as a medium so fascinating to me. Sort of unrelated, but while I'm talking about this movie, I really want to mention the scene where Moss is getting chased through the desert by trucks right as the sun is coming up. There's one specific shot in that scene where you can see two suns in the background. There's an episode of the Team Deacons podcast, I'll link it if I can find it, but don't count on it, where he is talking about how they created a fake sun by shooting 4 18K HMIs straight up into the sky. Well, it was fully nighttime so that they would have enough time to shoot the whole scene with essentially an 8+ hour dawn. But they ended up shooting until the real sun came up right next to Deacon's fake sun. And it makes it into the movie. There's one shot where it's two suns on the horizon, the Deacon's sun and the real sun. And it's so crazy how similar they look. Like Deacon's sun looks like the real sun, but he was able to replicate it forever. On the absolute other end of the spectrum is a movie like Poor Things. This film is so chock full of texture and fascinating devices used by Robbie Ryan, the DP, and Yorgos Lanthimos to tell that story. Obviously, Poor Things is extremely different in scope and style to both There Will Be Blood and No Country, both films that are almost completely locked into realism and telling very real, gritty stories. But I think it's also such a fascinating film because of how it's shot. The lenses that they chose to use add such a funk to this movie to the point where it is obviously distracting to the audience. Like it just is distracting. It's like you throw a whole crazy wide lens that doesn't cover the whole sensor, and it's like a peephole. You're looking through a fucking peephole into this insane world in the mind of Lanthimos. It's distracting. It just is. And that's okay. It's okay to be distracted by it because that's what they're doing. They're drawing your eye and they're showing you something that most people probably haven't seen. Anyway, I'm trying to like place myself in like a quote-unquote normie mindset about this movie, and I can't quite imagine how someone like my mother, a person who, if you had a pie chart of everything they had ever watched, 99% of the chart would be Friends. I'm trying to picture how she would react to this film. The vignetting from these Super 16 lenses put in front of a much larger sensor is just so blatantly stylistic that someone who has no idea how movies are made can't help but notice, right? You watch a movie like No Country for Old Men, no normal person notices two suns. No one's watching for that. No normal person notices the scuff marks on the floor. I obviously stole these examples from other media where someone explicitly states it and puts it on the fucking table for me to listen. I don't notice these things, and I obsess over this shit. But in Poor Things, people notice these funky, weird, fun camera tricks that just help to tell the funky, weird, fun story of Poor Things. Okay, turning the ship all the way around and revisiting my ramble about Bokeh, the exchange between Emma Stone's Bella Baxter and Christopher Abbott's Alfie Blessington. What a fucking crazy name, by the way. When they are walking through some trees, a perfect example of fun and funky Bokeh. It reminds me of one of my favorite and one of the most talked about lenses on the internet, the Helios 44-2. This lens has that characteristic swirly bokeh, which is caused by the incredibly hand-polished Soviet elements made in the 60s. I have no idea if they actually used the Helios to shoot this scene or not, but I love, look how the bokeh gets thinner and more stretched towards the edges of the frame, but in the center, it's still relatively spherical. It's still got a little funk to it in the middle, but as you get further and further away, it's just this swirl of bokeh that just focuses the eye on the performance. Now this is one of those scenes that I don't know if most people notice this type of shit, but you've got it, right? People have got to notice it. There's no fucking way that people don't notice this fucked ass bokeh. It looks so crazy. You might also notice how Ryan chose to frame both characters essentially in the center of the frame rather than rear thirds, which have been more traditional. I'm guessing whichever lens they used in this scene, has some crazy focus fall off near the edges of the frame, like it has to, right? To get that kind of bokeh, it just cannot be sharp on the edges. There's no fucking way. But it is relatively sharp in the middle, so you have no choice but to either have a soft subject or them be in the middle. Bring the conversation back to texture. My whole thesis with this video isn't just to admire some texture I've noticed while feeding my brain content, but to try and understand and maybe help you also understand that there are so many choices being made in the making of all of this that we consume on a daily basis. Even the most mediocre film had hundreds of conversations, minuscule, tiny conversations happened between the director and the DP, and pre-production, during production, post-production, and the grade, all of it about how it will look. Films are a sum of all of these choices, and if it weren't for them, none of these movies we love would be as unique and compelling as they are. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this disgustingly disjointed ramble about texture and whatever else my brain coughed out over the last however many minutes. Peace out. Keep watching movies. Bye-bye.